Hello, I'm Jim Deeks, and this is Canada Files. Our guest this week is one of the wealthiest and most successful businessmen in all of Canada. But unlike many of his peers on that list, Jimmy Pattison is a completely self-made man. Born on the prairies in 1928, but raised in Vancouver, Jimmy was a born entrepreneur. From starting his own GM dealership at age 32, today at 91, Jimmy Pattison continues to serve as the chairman, CEO, and sole owner of a vast and diverse worldwide conglomerate that employs 46,000 people and does nearly $11 billion in annual sales. We sat down with Jimmy Pattison here in his Vancouver boardroom. Mr. Pattison, everyone I've spoken to about you who knows you has said to me, he's a great guy, but he is driven. He's driven to work hard. He's driven to succeed. He's driven to win. He's driven to drive others hard, probably more than any other businessman in Canada. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, it could be. We work hard and we set goals, and sometimes we miss, so we start over again. But
to build an empire like you have built in the last 58 years, you must have some fair degree of drive. Where did that come from? Was it in the family DNA? Did it come from your parents? Did it come from the schoolyard? Where is the Pattison drive from?
I've never thought about that, but I've always, I came from a very humble family, and if I knew that if I needed a bike, I knew what I had to do, or a wagon or whatever it was. So I don't know. I like work, so if you like what you do, it's not work. So I like having a good time, and I like going to work.
You actually said in an interview recently that someone asked you, do you ever take a vacation? And your answer was, well, I have 365 days of vacation a year. Yeah. As you just said, if you like work, it's not work. Would you say that's been your guiding principle through your business career, just simply liking work?
Well, all of us like doing things that we like to do. Some people like watching sports. Some people like running. And I happen to like work, people, business, and we have lots of defeats, so we try to take the defeat and start over and try to fix what we did wrong.
You mentioned that you came from humble beginnings, and you, in fact, were born 11 months before the Depression hit in October 1929. How did the Depression affect your family and your upbringing, and what effect did it have on your approach to business, if any, over the years? What lessons did you learn?
The lessons I learned was that if you wanted something, you had to go find a way to do it yourself. Because I couldn't have had a better mother, I couldn't have had a better father, I was an only child. The only thing we didn't have is any money. But that never bothered us in the family. We just had a good family, and we didn't own a house until I had made some money and helped my dad buy a house. But I couldn't have had better parents, but I did know that if I wanted something, I was going to have to work for it.
Even before you really started out and bought your first car dealership in 1961, which, as you have said, is really the start of the Jim Pattison empire, the Jim Pattison Group. But even before then, after you had gotten out of school, what was your ambition? What did you see ahead for you?
Well, I didn't have a long-term vision. I had a short-term vision, which is I certainly liked cars, and And so I always I got into the used car business. I mean, selling used cars. I started at UBC, at the University of British Columbia. I'd buy a used car, drive it to school, and advertise it in the paper at the university. And I'd sell one and go back and buy another used one and sell it and drive it. So that's how I got in the car business. And my dad was a good salesman, and he was in the car business and became a manager of Packard here at the Packard dealership here in Vancouver. He didn't own it, but he became the manager there. And so I always was around cars, and I like cars.
And that was the foundation of the business, and
Yes.
it is still a major component of the business today.
Yes.
Is it still very much in your blood? Do you really have the softest spot in your heart for car retailing?
The answer is I have a keen interest in the car business, but usually we spend our times on the businesses that aren't doing well. So we buy a business and find where to give us a headache. So that's where we spend our time on.
And the car business is pretty much self-sustaining.
Well, we got good management there. It's all down to good management, and we've got excellent management in the car business, and we got 25 car dealerships, and we started with one, but it's a good management that's got us there.
Let's talk about the Jim Pattison Group for a minute. And I don't mean this to be a trick question, but can you just give us a quick overview of the business as it is today? How many divisions, companies, different businesses you're in?
We look at it by business, and we have 21 different operations, and some of them have a lot of locations, but we treat them as a separate business. We're in the food business, that's one. And we're in the car business, that's two. We're in the car leasing and truck leasing business, that's three. So that type of thing.
You have built the empire basically through acquisition. You've had some startups, but most of it has been acquisition. And by you personally over the years making the acquisitions yourself, how would you describe Jim Pattison, the acquisitor? Were you a tough negotiator? Were you a handshake kind of guy? Were you a relentless bully? Or were you just a consummate salesman? How did you manage to make all those acquisitions?
Well, the place that I was a salesman is at the banks, because I couldn't go buy this business unless I had the money, and I never had the money. So I was always at the mercy of the banks. And the Canadian banks have been very good to me over the years, and the American banks have also been good to us. So we're here because of the banking system.
Well, and you're not just here in Canada, you're worldwide. I mean, your 21 businesses stretch literally around the globe, correct?
We certainly are in places like Great Britain, we're in Denmark, of course, the United States is the most important country that we're in, other than Canada, where we've got a fair amount of business here, so on.
Back to the acquisitions. When you acquire a company, what kind of targets are you looking for? Are you looking for very successful, well-sustained businesses, or are you more looking for bargain basement deals where the companies aren't so well run, but they need the Pattison touch?
Well, both. And of course, the business is changing so rapidly now. I mean, the things that have built our company, which was the automobile retail business, car dealers, used car businesses, and the radio business. Those are the businesses that we started and got into, but as technology is changing rapidly, we are obviously moving what we're looking for very differently than what built the company was business in the old economy, if you like. But the changes that are coming in the car business and in communications like broadcasting is all very different than what helped build us our business.
Well, as you mentioned, you're in all these different businesses. I mean, there's forest products, media, i.e. television and radio, as you mentioned, grocery stores, car dealerships. It's a vast empire. Is there a business that you simply would not want to touch, that you just feel it wouldn't be right?
Oh, there's many of those businesses, because I don't think that we, like high-tech businesses, we wouldn't go into those because we don't know the first thing about it. You know, industry, there's so many different things coming out of high-tech that we just we don't buy things, we don't have a rough idea how it works.
You'll remember back in the 70s and 80s that there were a number of blue chip Canadian companies that decided to get into other lines of business. I think particularly of Bell Canada, which built Bell Canada Enterprises and diversified on the grounds that this was a good hedge against economic downturn. And as it turned out, that didn't work out well for a number of these blue chip companies. But the Pattison Group has flourished with diversification. How have you managed to do what these other well-capitalized companies couldn't do?
I can't speak for the other companies because they know what they're doing in their business. But in our case, we take the opportunity, look at, do we understand roughly how this business works? And the key is the management. And so that is number one, is who's going to run the business.
But at the same time, you've got to have people here at head office making sure that all those people are still running the business well. And with so many different disciplines that you're in, you've got to have a very robust head office as well.
No, the head office is the least important part of our company. We don't do much here. We buy the business, that's important. We decide that who's going to run the business, we look after compensation. But what's most important is the operations and the people in the field.
Let's talk about philanthropy a bit. You've stated many times in the past that you have a principle that says at least 10% of profits should be directed towards charitable and philanthropic causes. You've certainly given away personally probably hundreds of millions of dollars over the years. Does that mean you'll give away 10% of your personal worth when you finally breathe your last?
No, but we have a plan to accelerate the growth of the company. Everything's set up for the company to grow, and also our giving as we get bigger and more profitable as time goes by. If that happens, our formula will help us give more money to help other people.
What are some of the proudest projects or contributions that you've made from a philanthropic point of view?
Well, we don't like talking about that, but 10 blocks from where we're sitting, I used to work with my mother and dad in a gospel mission in Skid Row. About 10 blocks from here was where I worked with my mother and dad in a gospel mission till I was 26 years old. And we always had somebody that was down and out at a home for Sunday, for lunch or something like that. And my dad always taught me to give money. We used to call it tithing.
Yes.
And which was, I remember my dad gave me 50 cents. Now, Jimmy says, you put 5 cents in the collection plate. So I've always followed that rule.
You've been asked, I'm sure, many times over your life, or certainly over the last several years as you built the Pattison Group, why you never moved to the United States, where you probably could have made even more money and built an even bigger empire. And certainly you have a house in Palm Springs, a nicer climate than here in Vancouver. What has made you always stay in Vancouver?
Well, that's a really, really good question. It was my mother. My dad died at an early age, and my mother died at 94. I was an only child, and when I got going, my mother was getting older, and so I wanted to. Our people, we looked at moving to the States because you're quite right in what you just said. But my mother was here, and Vancouver is not an easy place to work from because you're always going to Toronto or Montreal, or you're going to Chicago or New York or Los Angeles.
Yep.
So it's
not a hub, for sure.
It is not a hub, at least for the limited amount of capital we had and roughly what we knew something about. So it was I think we talked about moving at one time, but I didn't want to leave my mother at her age by herself. I was an only child. So I stayed here and spent the time on the airplanes that we all do, traveling back and forth. But now that we are over in the Pacific, that Vancouver is actually a pretty good place to be when you're talking about Japan and China and South Korea and Thailand and places like that where we go.
Well, you've certainly made a name for yourself as a Canadian and a fiercely Canadian businessman. What does being Canadian mean to you?
It means that when you travel, you don't have much controversy about anything. So Canadians, with a Canadian passport, there's very few places that you're not welcome.
What do you think of yourself first as, a Vancouverite, a Western Canadian, or a Canadian?
Well, that's a very good question. I was born in Saskatchewan,
Yes.
and my dad came out here when I was 6 years old. I was raised here, so I consider, it depends on where I am, but I consider myself from Saskatchewan, but this is my home, and Canada's been very good to us.
You would well know that over the last perhaps 40 years, there's been a small but growing movement toward not toward Western alienation, but the Western provinces have been feeling perhaps not as well done by as some of the other parts of Canada, and there is now a movement toward perhaps even separating from Canada by the Western provinces. Being Canadian has been pretty good for you. What's your feeling about Western alienization and possible separation?
Well, Western alienation today is not new because it comes and goes. And one time when Quebec wanted to separate from Canada, there was a lot of discussion when Quebec talked about separating. And of course that has dissipated. But Canada is a large country as it relates to geography. I think it's the second largest country in the world from a geography point of view, but with a very small population. So as far as the West, and that comes and goes, and but overall Canadian passport's a pretty good passport to have.
But would it break your heart, or would it be good for business if indeed Western separation happened?
Well, I can't answer that because I don't think it's practical today that in fact, because separation from Quebec and Western alienation is not new. This is come and goes, depending on how the things are going and who's in Ottawa and so on. So I don't really think it's realistic. But today, it may change, but not today.
If you go back 40 years again, you would have noticed that there were a lot more Canadian companies, independent Canadian-owned companies, than there are today, multinational Canadian companies. Now they've been swallowed up, many of them,
Right.
mainly by American conglomerates, but you've remained fiercely independent. How long can you survive? Can Jim Pattison Group survive without being taken over, or are you just too big to be acquired?
No, we're not too big. We can stay where we are for a long time.
Well, with 21 divisions and over 300 companies,
But
I would think so.
don't forget, a lot of those divisions are in the United States, headquartered in the United States. We got Guinness World Records is headquartered in London, England. Ripley's, believe it or not, is headquartered in Orlando, Florida. Well, one of our big companies is our packaging company. It's headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so we're in the States, and we're in London, and and then we have our office here, which is keeps us in airplanes.
When you stand in your office just a couple of doors away, and you look out the window, I mean, I know you're a very busy businessman, but occasionally you must just look out the window, and I wonder what you say to yourself as you look back over the 58 years since you started your dealership. Do you look out the window and say, gosh, I am the most fantastically smart businessman in the world? Or do you think, gosh, I'm the luckiest guy that ever lived?
Well, first of all, when I look out the window, I can't think of a better place than Vancouver, with the mountains and the ocean and the scenery, and the climate is pretty good here as it relates to Canada. And no, we never think what you're talking about. We just looking for the next opportunity and dealing with the mistakes that I've already made.
You're 91 years old now.
Right.
I'm sure you think there's probably at least another decade in you, because you come to work, from what I understand, probably 7 days a week. You're very hardworking. Do you ever want to say, okay, I've had enough, and I'm not sure what you do with your company when you retire, because you are the sole owner, but is there a retirement plan for Jim Pattison?
Well, I've never thought of it. I've never thought about retiring, but someday I may. But I am very cognizant of the age that I am. So everything every decision I'm making is for the extension of the company for at least 25 years. And with the management and our financing, everything is for the company continues to grow whether I'm here or not.
Would you ever consider selling the company?
No.
No. Let me ask you just a quick series of questions. We haven't got much time, but what's the smartest decision you've ever made?
Smartest decision I've ever made was getting married to my wife in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, 68 years ago.
Very diplomatic answer, sir. What's the worst decision you've ever made?
Well, I've made so many bad decisions that I couldn't answer which is the worst, but I've made a lot of mistakes, a lot of decisions that I didn't spend enough time doing due diligence. I think the biggest mistake that as a company that I've made, is not doing enough due diligence on the decision that I make.
You've seen a lot of other corporate executives, some who have worked here, but you've seen many other businesses. What is the biggest mistake that corporate executives make?
Well, it's very different. I've been on the board of 20 companies, and including major Canadian bank, Bell Telephone Company, over the years, Paramount, but people make mistakes in big companies, and I've seen a lot of, including the mistakes that I make and we've made. I think is not knowing enough about due diligence on what to do next.
Well, clearly, Jimmy Pattison, you've had 58 years of success, maybe a couple of mistakes along the way, but your achievements speak for themselves. So thank you so much for having this discussion with us, and continued good luck to you. I hope there are many, many years ahead for you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching Canada Files. We'll see you on the next edition, we hope. Thanks.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, as well as the following donors: the John and Jocelyn Barford Family Foundation, Mary Alice Davis, in memory of Glenn W. Davis, John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, in memory of Peter A. Deeks, Richard and Donna Ivy, Alice and Ted Kernahan, Andrew and Valerie Pringle, Eleanor and Francis Shen, the Sonner Foundation, the Browning Watt Foundation, William E. Wilder, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.